To be a successful forensic scientist, you need more qualities than just your scientific knowledge and your ability to interpret the evidence. A really good forensic scientist will also have to be imaginative, creative, and innovative. This case about Buck Ruxton and the Jigsaw murders illustrates how this kind of thinking can be essential to solve a case which has a problem in it that has never been encountered before. The Buck Ruxton case starts back in 1935 in the little town of Moffat down in southern Scotland. And it's a nice town where people go for a little holiday. And running through it is a river. And there's a bridge over the river, and you can stand on the bridge and enjoy the view. And someone was doing just that when they noticed these rather odd packages down in the river. And when it was investigated, it was found that these packages were actually parts of human bodies wrapped up in newspaper, and presumably someone had thrown them in the river to get rid of them. Well, when all these packages had been collected up and opened, a problem very quickly became apparent. And the question was, how many bodies? Because it was clearly more than one. And the second question is, of course, who were they? And this is why it's called the Jigsaw murder, because the two pathologists who came in to work on this case, their first task was like a jigsaw, reassembling all the parts into a certain number of bodies. And when they had reassembled these human jigsaws, they could determine that they had two bodies, two female bodies. But where did these bodies come from? Well, that question was answered by the newspaper wrapping. Now, national newspapers in the United Kingdom are mostly printed in London and then distributed across the whole country. So they are not particular to any particular place. However, this murderer had made a mistake, because some of the newspaper wrapping had been for a special edition of the newspaper that had been printed for the town of Morecambe down in Lancashire. So the police officer in Moffat has to call his counterpart in Morecambe and ask him the very simple question, do you have two women missing? And sure enough, the Morecambe police were aware that two women had recently gone missing, a Mrs. Ruxton and her maid, Mary. I put the term Mrs. in quotation marks because she was not actually legally married to her husband, Buck Ruxton, which back in 1935 was a little bit scandalous, of course. Now, the two medical examiners, the pathologists, had reassembled the bodies. And now the police had two possible identities for the bodies. So this shows one of the bodies here. And you can see that a lot of the flesh, including all of the possible distinguishing marks, which would enable you to identify the body, have been removed. So the police and the pathologists were given the then unknown task of identifying the body. So they developed a new technique. What they did was to go to the Ruxton home down in Morecambe, and they looked for photographs of the women. And of course, when a photograph is taken, the subject of the photograph will pose at a particular angle and hold still while the photograph is taken. So what they did was to take the skulls from the river, hold those skulls at exactly the same angle that is in that photograph, take a picture, and then they superimposed the two photographs over each other. And here is the result. And you can see there is Mrs. Ruxton, you can see her face, you can see that typical 1930s type of hat, and you can see the skull. And you can see there's a perfect match up between the face of the skull and the face of Mrs. Ruxton. And this is the technique they used to try to prove that the bodies were those of Mrs. Ruxton and the maid Mary. Buck Ruxton was arrested. This wasn't the only evidence, of course. When his house was examined, there were bloodstains everywhere, for instance. So there was certainly evidence that something horrible had happened in his home. He went to trial. He claimed he was innocent, but the jury thought otherwise. He was convicted of murder, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. The case was a little bit controversial at the time, and some people writing in newspapers claimed that this evidence here, these photographs, this was not good enough to convict someone of murder and send them to hang. However, the controversy was ended by Buck Ruxton himself. On his way to execution, he confessed. He had done the murders, and that confession fully validated this new technique that these innovative pathologists had used in this case. In the first part of the 20th century, police forces around the world started to set up their own specialized forensic laboratories. So one of the first, of course, was in Lyon, set up by Lockhart himself, and then other countries in Europe followed suit. And also in the United States, laboratories started to be set up. So by 1932, the FBI had set up a national laboratory in the United States, and a few years later, Scotland Yard's lab was set up. Singapore's facilities were set up much later. Chao Zi-Cheng, who we have already mentioned, started his work in the 1960s. But even as early as 1929, there was a chemical analysis service available to the Straits Settlement Police. Nowadays, Singapore's facilities are all part of the Health Sciences Authority. So I think we have already realized that forensic science is a very, very diverse subject. So a forensic science laboratory would contain within it many different units to handle all sorts of different kinds of science. Now, in this section, we'll talk about some of those different units that might be in a forensic science laboratory. And while some of them are clearly essential for any forensic science lab, others would only exist in the more specialized or more extensive laboratories, and a few might be separate skills which would not be in a forensic science lab itself. So a forensic science lab would be likely to have some kind of physical science unit, and such a unit would handle a lot of chemical and physical analyses, including chemical tests, spectroscopy, microscopy. It might deal with drugs, it might deal with material fragments such as glass and paint, it might deal with explosives, soil, and so on, a collection of miscellaneous items. A biology unit might also exist. Forensic scientists often have to analyze biological samples such as hair, or for instance, botanical samples such as plants. One facility, one capability that is essential is DNA. A forensic science laboratory nowadays has to have access to DNA analysis services, and we're going to have a separate lecture on that topic. A firearms unit might be important as well. How important, of course, depends on which country you're in. And this unit would deal with guns, would deal with bullets, would deal with cartridge cases, and so forth. Documents. Some forensic science laboratories have a specialized group to look at documents, to determine whether documents have been faked or forged, and these might have experts who specialize in the analysis of handwriting, print, paper, ink, etc. Another specialized unit that some places will have is a photography unit. Not only is photography important for recording evidence and then presenting the evidence, there are also specialists who can analyze photographs to see whether they are genuine photographs. If you take a look at this photograph, it shows the late leader of North Korea. And there was a time when he disappeared from public view, and there was much speculation in the West that he was ill. To attempt to dampen down this speculation, the North Koreans issued this photograph. But if you look at it carefully, you notice a few oddities about it. For instance, on the left and the right of the photograph, you can see a black line running along the wall. But that black line does not run behind Mr. Kim. You can also see that this photograph was taken when the sun was at a low angle, either early morning or late afternoon, and you can see the shadow of the soldier's legs. But curiously, the shadow of Mr. Kim's legs is at a quite different angle to the other shadows. These are things that a photographer could see just by inspection, but a more careful analysis reveals that the pixels that make up the photograph don't match. So the pixels near to Mr. Kim's ankles don't match the pixels on the wall just next to it. So the conclusion is that this photograph is not a genuine photograph, it's been photoshopped. Here's another photograph which caused a great deal of controversy over many, many decades. This is the so-called surgeon's photograph taken in 1934 on the banks of Loch Ness in Scotland, and it purports to show the Loch Ness monster swimming in the lake. Analysis of this photograph couldn't reach a conclusion. It turns out that the photograph is absolutely genuine. There was no tampering with the photograph. In this case, it's the monster that's a fake. Okay, it was a model monster, and somebody just put it in the lake and photographed it. It took many years for it to be exposed as a hoax, and that's because the man who did the hoax didn't confess to it until he was on his deathbed, which turned out to be 60 years later. Toxicology is another important capability to have access to, and this involves the analysis of body fluids. For instance, if someone is found dead on their bed and there's an empty bottle of sleeping pills next to them, then of course you're going to analyze the blood or body fluids of that person to see if there's a high concentration of whatever drug is in their system. And fingerprinting is very important. So the police or the forensic science laboratory have to have access to technology, not only the expertise to look at fingerprints, but also the technology to make fingerprints visible, as not all fingerprints are immediately visible. And this will be the subject of another lecture. On TV shows, you often see the polygraph or the lie detector, and some laboratories or police forces will also have this facility. And so it raises the interesting question of, can we detect a lie using science? Well, you can try, but generally most jurisdictions do not accept polygraph results as evidence. A very specialized form of forensic science is voice print analysis. If the only thing you have that it purports to come from someone is the sound of their voice, can you prove that that voice actually came from that person? So when Osama bin Laden was still alive, occasionally audio recordings purportedly of him would start to circulate, and agencies such as the CIA would do a voice print analysis to see if they really were from bin Laden. This technology was also used in the 1970s concerning the eccentric, reclusive millionaire or billionaire Howard Hughes. In 1971, an author called Clifford Irving was claiming that he had a manuscript which was the authorized biography of Howard Hughes. And he was paid a very large sum of money by one of the big publishers for the rights to this authorized biography. Well, when Mr. Hughes heard about this, he was clearly quite upset because he hadn't authorized any biographies, and he denied that this was the authorized biography. To make his denial, he organized a teleconference, and he had to do it by a teleconference. He was an extreme recluse. He never appeared in public, and at the time he was staying in a luxury penthouse in the Bahamas. So the assembled journalists could listen to his voice over the telephone line coming from the Bahamas. But how do you prove that it really is Howard Hughes' voice? Well, of course, this was done by voice print analysis, and when the recording of Hughes at the teleconference was compared to a recording of him speaking many years before, it was confirmed that it really was his voice, and consequently, the author of the so-called authorized biography was subsequently convicted for fraud. Another technique sometimes used by police forces is psychiatric profiling. And this is trying to tell something about the criminal from the way that the crime has been committed. This probably wouldn't be a facility in a forensic science laboratory. An expert psychiatrist would be called into the case. And we'll have a little discussion of this in one of the later lectures. Computer forensics is becoming increasingly important. A large part of computer forensics is retrieving data that has been deleted from computers. In addition, as data is transmitted around the world electronically, it's also following that electronic trail to find out where people have gone. Now, forensic engineering, this is not a subject that a forensic science laboratory would likely to have. This would be done by a professional engineer who was qualified or experienced in this area. So what is forensic engineering? Well, for example, in the picture you can see the I-35 bridge in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which collapsed in August 2007. So forensic engineers were called in to determine why the bridge collapsed. The initial theory that went round in this case was that it was due to the corrosive effect of pigeon droppings, but it was later concluded that it was actually a design fault when the bridge was originally built. Forensic entomology. Entomology is the study of insects, and forensic entomology is where you use the insect population of the crime scene to gain some information. And again, we'll talk about this subject in a later lecture. Forensic geology, this is soil analysis. We'll have one example in a later lecture. Curiously, forensic geology is something that is much more common in Sherlock Holmes stories than in real forensic science. Now, forensic anthropology is quite an important topic, and this concerns the analysis of skeletal remains. So if a skeleton is found, it has to be identified, and it's usually the job of a forensic anthropologist to do this. Skeletal remains do appear if somebody dies in a place where nobody ever goes to. Then the body can decompose, and by the time it's finally found, all that remains is a skeleton. For instance, in 2011, a bank in Abbeville, Louisiana was doing some serious renovations to their building, and they had an old building, and it included a proper old-fashioned chimney, and when they knocked open the chimney, they found a human skeleton. And this was subsequently identified as being the skeleton of this man, Joseph Schexnayder, who disappeared more than a quarter of a century before in 1984. So in this case, the forensic anthropologists were able to identify who the skeleton belonged to, but of course any evidence about how he died or why he was in the chimney had disappeared. Now, one of the techniques that forensic anthropologists will use is called facial reconstruction. What they do is to take the skull and then rebuild the flesh on the skull so that you can see what that person looked like when they were alive. Sometimes this technique is remarkably successful. So here, for instance, on the left you can see the reconstruction, on the right you can see the real person. In this case, the skeleton was found rolled up in a carpet, And the forensic anthropologists also had the bonus that the hair was preserved, which can make a big difference to the appearance. So after the face was reconstructed, the image was shown on a TV program, and people called in and said they recognized the person. And once the police had the name of the victim, they could then start the investigation into what had happened. And in this case, it led to the conviction of the murderer. It's not always so easy. In this second case here on the left, you can see the person, and he was killed in the terrible underground fire at King's Cross Station in London in 1987. The reconstructed face is on the right, and it took more than 15 years before family members came forward and made the identification. In this case, it's possibly because the man was much older than had been expected, and it's very difficult to tell about age accurately from skeletal remains. Now, both these cases I've shown here, the facial reconstruction is done using modeling clay. And nowadays, of course, it can be done by computer, and it can be done electronically. Odontology is surprisingly important. Odontology is the study of teeth. Many times, teeth can be used to identify people by comparing the teeth in the head or the skull with whatever dental records are available. Sometimes odontology comes in with other uses. This is Ted Bundy. He was one of the most famous serial killers in the United States of America, and he specialized in young female college students. Now, Bundy was a pretty clever guy. He was actually a law student himself, and he was very careful to make sure that he never left any evidence behind. But he made a mistake in one case, and he actually bit one of his victims, leaving his teeth marks in the body. So with an order from a judge, the police were able to force Bundy to give a tooth impression, and when that was compared to the bite mark in the body, it proved that Bundy had been the murderer. And Ted Bundy was executed in January 1989. Now, teeth don't have to be real teeth. They can also be false teeth. This is the story of J.G. Haig, nicknamed Acid Bath Haig, who was finally convicted of his crimes back in 1949. It's believed that he killed 9 people, but the person who led to his capture was an elderly lady called Olive Durand Deacon. Now, Haig lived in a hotel in London, but he also had a shed out in the countryside, and he lured Mrs. Durand Deacon to his place in the countryside with some talk of investments and business of some kind. Now, Haig was a fairly clever man, but not a very clever man. And he'd heard this concept that it's not possible to have a conviction for a crime without a body. Unfortunately, he'd misunderstood the concept. The concept is that there must be the body of evidence to prove that a crime had occurred. But Haig took it very literally and thought that it had to be a real body, and if there was no real body, then there could be no murder charge. So what Haig very carefully did was to make sure he destroyed the bodies of all his victims, and he did this by dissolving them in concentrated sulfuric acid. So he would put the body in a drum with conc sulfuric acid for several days, come back later when the body had dissolved, and simply pour the whole mess down the drain. Well, when Mrs. Durand Deacon had disappeared and the police were called, they went to Haig's place to investigate. And they found 2 items that proved to them that Mrs. Durand Deacon had been murdered. One was a gallstone, and the other one was her false teeth. And both of these items are quite difficult to dissolve in sulfuric acid. Of course, false teeth are highly individualized. So simply taking the false teeth to Mrs. Durand Deacon's dentist, they could identify them and prove that it was her.